Good morning. Today we will read chapters 16, 17, and 18 in Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Starting with chapter 16, The Oompa Loompas. Oompa Loompas, everyone said at once. Oompa Loompas? Imported directly from Loopaland, said Mr. Wonka proudly. There is no such place, said Mrs. Salt. Excuse me, dear lady, but Mr. Wonka, cried Mrs. Salt, I am a teacher of geography. Then you'll know all about it, said Mr. Wonka. And oh, what a terrible country it is! Nothing but thick jungles infested by the most dangerous beasts in the entire world. Hornswogglers and snozwangers, and those terrible wicked wangdoodles. A wangdoodle would eat 10 Oompa Loompas for breakfast and come galloping back for a second helping. When I went out there, I found the little Oompa Loompas living in tree houses. They had to live in tree houses to escape from the wangdoodles and the hornswogglers and the snozwangers. And they were practically starving to death. They were living on green caterpillars, and the caterpillars tasted revolting. And the Oompa Loompas spent every moment of their days climbing through the treetops looking for other things to mash up with the caterpillars to make them taste better. Red beetles, for instance, and eucalyptus leaves, and the bark of the bonbon tree, all of them beastly, but not quite so beastly as the caterpillars. Poor little Oompa Loompas. The one food they longed for more than any other was the cacao bean, but they couldn't get it. An Oompa Loompa was lucky if he found 3 or 4 cacao beans a year. But oh, how they craved them. They used to dream about cacao beans all night and talk about them all day. You had only to mention the word cacao to an Oompa Loompa, and he would start dribbling at the mouth. The cacao bean, Mr. Wonka continued, which grows on the cacao tree, happens to be the thing from which all chocolate is made. You cannot make chocolate without the cacao bean. The cacao bean is chocolate. I myself use billions of cacao beans every week in this factory. And so, my dear children, as soon as I discovered that the Oompa Loompas were crazy for this particular food, I climbed up to their treehouse village and poked my head in through the door of the treehouse belonging to the leader of the tribe. The poor little fellow, looking thin and starved, was sitting there trying to eat a bowl full of mashed up green caterpillars without being sick. Look here, I said, speaking not in English, of course, but in Oompa Loompish. Look here, if you and all your people will come back to my country and live in my factory, you can have all the cacao beans you want. I've got mountains of them in my storehouses. You can have cacao beans for every meal. You can gorge yourself silly on them. I'll even pay your wages in cacao beans if you wish. You really mean it? Asked the Oompa Loompa leader, leaping up from his chair. Of course I mean it, I said. And you can have chocolate as well. Chocolate tastes even better than cacao beans because it's got milk and sugar added. The little man gave a great whoop of joy and threw his bowl of mashed caterpillars right out of the treehouse window. It's a deal, he cried. Come on, let's go. So I shipped them all over here, every man, woman, and child in the Oompa Loompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing cases with holes in them, and they all got here safely. They are wonderful workers. They all speak English now. They love dancing and music. They're always making up songs. I expect you will hear a good deal of singing today from time to time. I must warn you, though, that they are rather mischievous. They like jokes. They still wear the same kind of clothes they wore in the jungle. They insist upon that. The men, as you can see for yourselves across the river, wear only deerskins. The women wear leaves, and the children wear nothing at all. The women use fresh leaves every day. "Daddy!" shouted Veruca Salt, the girl who got everything she wanted. "Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa. I want you to get me an Oompa Loompa. I want an Oompa Loompa right away. I want to take it home with me. Go on, Daddy, get me an Oompa Loompa." Now, my pet," her father said to her. "We mustn't interrupt Mr. Wonka." "But I want an Oompa Loompa!" screamed Veruca. "All right, Veruca, all right, but I can't get it for you this second. Please be patient. I'll see you have one before the day is out." "Augustus!" shouted Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus, sweetheart, I don't think you had better to do that." Augustus Gloop, as you might have guessed, had quietly sneaked down to the edge of the river, and he was now kneeling on the riverbank, scooping hot, melted chocolate into his mouth as fast as he could. Chapter 17. Augustus Gloop Goes Up the Pipe. When Mr. Wonka turned round and saw what Augustus Gloop was doing, he cried out, "Oh no, please, Augustus, please! I beg of you not to do that. My chocolate must be untouched by human hands." "Augustus," called out Mrs. Gloop, "didn't you hear what the man said? Come away from the river at once." "This stuff is terrific," said Augustus, taking not the slightest notice of his mother or Mr. Wonka. "Oh boy, I need a bucket to drink it properly." "Augustus!" cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down and waggling his stick in the air. "You must come away. You are dirtying the chocolate." "Augustus!" cried Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus!" cried Mr. Gloop. But Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. He was now lying full length on the ground, with his head far out over the river, lapping up the chocolate like a dog. "Augustus!" shouted Mrs. Gloop. "You'll be giving that nasty cold of yours to about 1,000,000 people all over the country." "Be careful, Augustus!" shouted Mr. Gloop. "You're leaning too far out." Mr. Gloop was absolutely right. For suddenly there was a shriek and then a splash, and into the river went Augustus Gloop, and in 1 second he had disappeared under the brown surface. "Save him!" screamed Mrs. Gloop, going white in the face and waving her umbrella about. "He'll drown! He can't swim a yard! Save him! Save him!" "Good heavens, woman," said Mr. Gloop. "I'm not diving in there. I've got my best suit on." Augustus Gloop's face came up again to the surface, painted brown with chocolate. "Help! Help! Help!" he yelled. "Fish me out!" "Don't just stand there!" Mrs. Gloop screamed at Mr. Gloop. "Do something!" "I am doing something," said Mr. Gloop, who was now taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate. But while he was doing this, the wretched boy was being sucked closer and closer toward the mouth of one of the great pipes that was dangling down into the river. Then all at once, the powerful suction took hold of him completely, and he was pulled under the surface and then into the mouth of the pipe. The crowd on the riverbank waited breathlessly to see where he would come out. "There he goes!" somebody shouted, pointing upwards. And sure enough, because the pipe was made of glass, Augustus Gloop could be clearly seen shooting up inside it, head first, like a torpedo. "Help! Murder! Police!" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus, come back at once! Where are you going?" "It's a wonder to me," said Mr. Gloop, "how that pipe is big enough for him to go through it." "It isn't big enough," said Charlie Bucket. "Oh dear, look, he's slowing down." "So he is," said Grandpa Joe. "He's going to stick," said Charlie. "I think he is," said Grandpa Joe. "By golly, he has stuck," said Charlie. "It's his stomach that's done it," said Mr. Gloop. "He's blocked the whole pipe," said Grandpa Joe. "Smash the pipe!" yelled Mrs. Gloop, still waving her umbrella. "Augustus, come out of there at once!" The watchers below could see the chocolate swishing around the boy in the pipe, and they could see it building up behind him in a solid mass, pushing against the blockage. The pressure was terrific. Something had to give. Something did give, and that was Augustus. Woof! Up he shot again like a bullet in the barrel of a gun. "He's disappeared!" yelled Mrs. Gloop. "Where does that pipe go to? Quick, call the fire brigade!" "Keep calm," cried Mr. Wonka. "Keep calm, my dear lady, keep calm. There is no danger whatsoever. Augustus has gone on a little journey, that's all. A most interesting little journey, but he'll come out of it just fine, you wait and see." "How could he possibly come out fine?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "He'll be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds. "Impossible!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Unthinkable! Inconceivable! Absurd! He could never be made into marshmallows." "And why not, may I ask?" shouted Mrs. Gloop. "Because that pipe doesn't go to the marshmallow room," Mr. Wonka answered. "It doesn't go anywhere near it. That pipe, the one Augustus went up, happens to lead directly to the room where I make a most delicious kind of strawberry-flavored chocolate-coated fudge." "Then he'll be made into strawberry-flavored chocolate-coated fudge!" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "My poor Augustus! They'll be selling him by the pound all over the country tomorrow morning." "Quite right," said Mr. Gloop. "I know I'm right," said Mrs. Gloop. "It's beyond a joke," said Mr. Gloop. "Mr. Wonka doesn't seem to think so," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Just look at him. He's laughing his head off. How dare you laugh like that when my boy's just gone up the pipe? You monster!" she shrieked, pointing her umbrella at Mr. Wonka as though she were going to run through. "You think it's a joke, do you? You think that sucking my boy up into your fudge room like that is just one big colossal joke?" "He'll be perfectly safe," said Mr. Wonka, giggling slightly. "He'll be chocolate fudge!" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Never!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Of course he will!" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "I wouldn't allow it!" cried Mr. Wonka. "And why not?" shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Because the taste would be terrible," said Mr. Wonka. "Just imagine it. Augustus flavored chocolate-coated gloop? No one would buy it." "They most certainly would," cried Mr. Gloop indignantly. "I don't want to think about it," shrieked Mrs. Gloop. "Nor do I," said Mr. Wonka, "and I do promise you, madam, that your darling boy is perfectly safe." "If he's perfectly safe, then where is he?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "Lead me to him this instant." Mr. Wonka turned around and clicked his finger sharply, click, 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 3 times. Immediately, an Oompa Loompa appeared, as if from nowhere, and stood beside him. The Oompa Loompa bowed and smiled, showing beautifully white teeth. His skin was rosy white, his long hair was golden brown, and the top of his head came just above the height of Mr. Wonka's knee. He wore the usual deerskin slung over his shoulder. "Now listen to me," said Mr. Wonka, looking down at the tiny man. "I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Gloop up to the fudge room and help them to find their son Augustus. He's gone up the pipe." The Oompa Loompa took one look at Mrs. Gloop and exploded into peals of laughter. "Oh, do be quiet," said Mr. Wonka. "Control yourself. Pull yourself together. Mrs. Gloop doesn't think it's at all funny." "You can say that again," said Mrs. Gloop. "Go straight to the fudge room," Mr. Wonka said to the Oompa Loompa, "and when you get there, take a long stick and start poking around inside the big chocolate mixing barrel. I'm almost certain you'll find him there." "But you'd better look sharp. You'll have to hurry. If you leave him in the chocolate mixing barrel too long, he's liable to get poured out into the fudge boiler, and that would be a disaster, wouldn't it? My fudge would become quite unedible." Mrs. Gloop let out a shriek of fury. "I'm joking," said Mr. Wonka, giggling madly behind his beard. "I didn't mean it. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. Goodbye, Mrs. Gloop and Mr. Gloop. Goodbye, goodbye. I'll see you later." As Mrs. Gloop, Mr. Gloop and Mrs. Gloop and their tiny escort hurried away, the 5 Oompa Loompas on the far side of the river suddenly began hopping and dancing about and beating wildly upon a number of very small drums. "Augustus Gloop," they chanted. "Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop." "Grandpa," cried Charlie. "Listen to them, Grandpa." "What are they doing?" "Shh," whispered Grandpa Joe. "I think they're going to sing us a song." "Augustus Gloop," chanted the Oompa Loompas. "Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, the great big greedy nincompoop. How long could we allow this beast to gorge and guzzle, feed and feast on everything he wanted to? Great Scott, it simply wouldn't do. However long this pig might live, we're positive he'd never give even the smallest bit of fun or happiness to anyone. So what we do in cases such as this, we use the gentle touch, and carefully we take the brat and turn him into something that will give great pleasure to us all. A doll, for instance, or a ball, or marbles, or a rocking horse. But this revolting boy, of course, was so unutterably vile, so greedy, foul, and infantile, he left a most disgusting taste inside our mouths, and so in haste we chose a thing that, come what may, would take the nasty taste away. "Come on," we cried, "the time is ripe to send him shooting up the pipe. He has to go, it has to be, and very soon he's going to see. Inside the room to which he's gone, some funny things are going on. But don't, dear children, be alarmed. Augustus Gloop will not be harmed, although, of course, we must admit he will be altered quite a bit. He will be quite changed from what he's been. Where he goes through the fudge machine, slowly the wheels go round and round, the cogs begin to grind and pound, 100 knives to slice, slice, slice. We add some sugar, cream, and spice. We boil him for a minute more until we're absolutely sure that all the greed and all the gall is boiled away for once and all. Then out he comes, and now, by grace, a miracle has taken place. This boy, who only just before was loathed by men from shore to shore, this greedy brute, this louse's ear, is loved by people everywhere. For who could hate or bear a grudge against a luscious bit of fudge? "I told you they loved singing," cried Mr. Wonka. "Aren't they delightful? Aren't they charming? But you mustn't believe a word they said. It's all nonsense, every bit of it." Are the Oompa Loompas really joking, Grandpa? Asked Charlie. Of course they're joking, answered Grandpa Joe. They must be joking. At least I hope they're joking. Don't you? Chapter 18, Down the Chocolate River. Off we go, cried Mr. Wonka. Hurry up, everybody, follow me to the next room, and please don't worry about Augustus Gloop. He's bound to come out in the wash. They always do. We shall have to make the next part of the journey by boat. Here she comes, look. A steamy mist was rising up now from the great warm chocolate river, and out of the mist there appeared suddenly a most fantastic pink boat. It was a large open rowboat with a tall front and tall back, like a Viking boat of old, and it was of such a shining, sparkling, glistening pink color that the whole thing looked as though it were made of bright pink glass. There were many oars on either side of it, and as the boat came closer, the watchers on the riverbank could see that the oars were being pulled by masses of Oompa Loompas, at least 10 of them to each oar. "This is my private yacht," cried Mr. Wonka, beaming with pleasure. "I made her by hollowing out an enormous boiled sweet. Isn't she beautiful? See how she comes cutting through the river." The gleaming pink boiled sweet boat glided up to the riverbank. 100 Oompa Loompas rested on their oars and stared up at the visitors. Then suddenly, for some reason best known to themselves, they all burst into shrieks of laughter. "What's so funny?" asked Violet Beauregard. "Oh, don't worry about them," cried Mr. Wonka. "They're always laughing. They think everything's a colossal joke. Jump into the boat, all of you. Come on, hurry up." As soon as everyone was safely in, the Oompa Loompas pushed the boat away from the bank and began to row swiftly down the river. "Hey, there! Mike Teavee," shouted Mr. Wonka. "Please do not lick the boat with your tongue. It'll only make it sticky." "Daddy," said Veruca Salt, "I want a boat like this. I want you to buy me a big pink boiled sweet boat exactly like Mr. Wonka's, and I want lots of Oompa Loompas to row me about, and I want a chocolate river, and I want... She wants a good kick in the pants," whispered Grandpa Joe to Charlie. The old man was sitting in the back of the boat, and little Charlie was right beside him. Charlie was holding tightly onto his grandfather's bony hand. He was in a whirl of excitement. Everything he had seen so far, the great chocolate river, the waterfall, the huge sucking pipes, the candy meadows, the Oompa Loompas, the beautiful pink boat, and most of all, Mr. Willy Wonka himself, had been so astonishing that he began to wonder whether there could possibly be any more astonishments left. Where were they going now? What were they going to see? And what in the world was going to happen in the next room? "Isn't it marvelous?" said Grandpa Joe, grinning at Charlie. Charlie nodded and smiled up at the old man. Suddenly, Mr. Wonka, who was sitting on Charlie's other side, reached down into the bottom of the boat and picked up a large mug, dipped it in the river, filled it with chocolate, and handed it to Charlie. "Drink this," he said. "It'll do you good. You look starved to death." Then Mr. Wonka filled a second mug and gave it to Grandpa Joe. "You too," he said. "You look like a skeleton. What's the matter? Hasn't there been anything to eat in your house lately?" "Not much," said Grandpa Joe. Charlie put the mug to his lips, and as the rich, warm, creamy chocolate ran down his throat into his empty tummy, his whole body from head to toe began to tingle with pleasure, and a feeling of intense happiness spread over him. "You like it?" asked Mr. Wonka. "Oh, it's wonderful," Charlie said. "The creamiest, loveliest chocolate I've ever tasted," said Grandpa Joe, smacking his lips. "That's because it's been mixed by waterfall," Mr. Wonka told him. The boat sped down the river. The river was getting narrower, and there was some kind of dark tunnel ahead, a great round tunnel that looked like an enormous pipe. And the river was running into the tunnel, and so was the boat. "Row on!" shouted Mr. Wonka, jumping up and waving his stick in the air. "Full speed ahead!" And with the Oompa Loompas rowing faster than ever, the boat shot into the pitch-dark tunnel, and all the passengers screamed with excitement. "How can they see where they're going?" shrieked Violet Beauregard in the darkness. "There's no knowing where they're going," cried Mr. Wonka, hooting with laughter. "There's no earthly way of knowing which direction they are going. There's no knowing where they're rowing or which way the river's flowing. Not a speck of light is showing, so the danger must be growing. For the rowers keep on rowing, and they're certainly not showing any signs that they are slowing." "He's gone off his rocker," shouted one of the fathers, aghast, and the other parents joined in the chorus of frightening shouting. "He's crazy," they shouted. "He's balmy, he's nutty, he's screwy, he's batty, he's dippy, he's dotty, he's daffy, he's goofy, he's beany, he's wacky, he's loony." "No, he is not," said Grandpa Joe. "Switch on the lights," shouted Mr. Wonka. And suddenly, on came the lights, and the whole tunnel was brilliantly lit up, and Charlie could see that they were indeed inside a gigantic pipe, and the great upward curving walls of the pipe were pure white and spotlessly clean. The river of chocolate was flowing very fast inside the pipe, and the Oompa Loompas were all rowing like crazy, and the boat was rocketing along at a furious pace. Mr. Wonka was jumping up and down in the back of the boat and calling to the rowers to row faster and faster still. He seemed to love the sensation of whizzing through a white tunnel in a pink boat on a chocolate river, and he clapped his hands and laughed and kept glancing at his passengers to see if they were enjoying it as much as he. "Look, Grandpa," cried Charlie. "There's a door in the wall." It was a green door, and it was set into the wall of the tunnel just above the level of the river. As they flashed past it, there was just enough time to read the writing on the door. "Storeroom number 54, it said. "All the creams. Dairy cream, whipped cream, violet cream, coffee cream, pineapple cream, vanilla cream, and hair cream." "Hair cream?" cried Mike TV. "You don't use hair cream." "Row on!" shouted Mr. Wonka. "There is no time to answer silly questions." They streaked past a black door. "Storeroom number 71, it said on it. "Whips, all shapes and sizes." "Whips!" cried Veruca Salt. "What on earth do you use whips for?" "For whipping cream, of course," said Mr. Wonka. "How can you whip cream without whips? Whipped cream isn't whipped cream at all unless it's been whipped with whips. Just as a poached egg isn't a poached egg unless it's been stolen from the woods in the dead of night. Row on now, please." They passed a yellow door on which it said, "Storeroom number 77. All the beans. Cacao beans, coffee beans, jelly beans, and has-beens." "Has-beens?" cried Violet Beauregard. "You're one yourself," said Mr. Wonka. "There's no time for arguing. Press on, press on." But 5 seconds later, when a bright red door came into sight ahead, He suddenly waved his gold-topped cane in the air and shouted, "Stop the boat!" And that is the end of chapter 18. So after reading today, in the chapter packet, we will flip to page 11 and do the pages for chapters 16, 17, and 18. Pages 11 and pages 12. In the vocabulary packet, we will still be working on pages 3 and 4. We learned today the words mischievous, fury, and colossal. So you'll be able to define fury. You'll be able to complete this chart on page 3 for colossal. And then on page 4, you will be able to find a synonym up here for mischievous. If you wanted to do something in the activity packet today, you could do the page on Augustus Gloop. It's the character analysis wheel. It looks like this in your activity packet. And we will be back tomorrow to continue reading.